Hello and welcome to The Nation This Week. You're joining me, Elane, Noor, Abdullah, coming to you live from the capital city of Kuala Lumpur. We have a very robust discussion ahead of us. Some of the interesting topics that we'll be touching on today include the endemic phase, which has been announced to begin on the 1st of April. We'll also be discussing the International Women's Day, which happened earlier this week on the 8th of March, and Johor polls as we speak, as well as the border reopening. Joining me in discussion and in conversation today are the following, my panelists: EIZAZ AZHAR Managing Director, Samsuri Associates, Dr. HELMY HAJA MYDIN, Respiratory Physician, Dr. A.T. KUMARARAJAH, Treasurer General, NCCIM. Welcome, gentlemen, to The Nation This Week. Let's talk about, of course, the conversation that is on everybody's lips at this point of time, the endemic phase. This is upcoming on the 1st of April. I'm sure there's a lot of concerns and there's a lot of people that are elated, but there's also a lot of issues that we have to look into. So let's talk about the endemic phase. Perhaps we can get a view from any of our panelists. Let's start with you, AP. You're down below here. Let's talk about what you think about the endemic phase before we go into you, EIZAZ.
Right. So, Elane, I think, the what do you call the terminology must be caught right. So what the minister says is transition to endemic that starts now. I think this endemic is the most misused word as far as when the pandemic started. Because as far as what I've read, I'm sure Dr. Helmy will be able to add on, it is only the WHO that actually says, look, everything has become endemic. But I think many countries have taken this endemic kind of an approach to it. And I think we also have been very, very right. We've got, nearly 98% of our population, adult population already vaccinated, close to 2/3 with a booster. So I think we are in the right position to move on, because many countries, I think Australia, Thailand, to name a few, who has actually moved on to that transition to endemic phase. With the face mask on, I think that restrictions, that's the caution that we have taken. And I think that a very safe approach towards opening up and making sure, I think we are back 95% back normal, sort of an approach. I think that's a pretty good step.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of expectation for some kind of semblance of normalcy to return to everyday lives with the announcement of the and as you mentioned, transitioning into endemic phase, because It's not necessarily like 1st of April, April Fools, everything opens and hello. It's just on the endemic phase.
I think we're beginning to see, I would say, governance that's starting into the right direction. So KKM, I believe, recently released a guideline, right? If I'm a close contact, I don't really have to be quarantined anymore, if I'm not mistaken, right? I just have to take a test on day 1 and test on day 3, and I'm pretty much free to go around, right? And from a governance and a regulatory perspective, that's going to be interesting, because I think we kind of pre-moved to endemic anyway. Maybe about a couple of months ago, people were going out, people were enjoying life, businesses were starting to resume. I don't think it's going to be a very difficult transition to it. But regulatory-wise, what are we going to enforce? What are we not going to enforce, right? And it would obviously be very, very good to see businesses starting to come back, restaurants starting to open again. But my concern would always be around the regulatory aspect. Right? We can't have like a strong arm sort of regulatory push anymore once we go into endemic. And that safety always has to take precedence, especially with the Omicron virus. Now, I've been looking at it from what happens if it mutates, right? And now when we start to open up the borders, which is another interesting topic, we're going to get all sorts of potential variants that could happen. So are we prepared to not lock down, but to take action should an incident happen again?
Yeah, so that before I go into border reopening, Doc, your thoughts on the endemic phase, especially from the health perspective as well.
I agree with what Datuk was saying, which is that there is I suppose, a medical definition of what endemic is, pandemic is, and so on and so forth. And it's really a very academic debate, which is very dry. But essentially, what we are seeing is really, in a way, messaging to say that, hey guys, we've lived with this for a number of years now. We are in a different state in terms of protection, because more than 3 million people have had it. We've had lots of people who've been vaccinated, boosted. we're getting our kids vaccinated. So it's something that we're going to have to learn to live with in a different way compared to what happened a year or two ago. So we are dealing with, record numbers, right? It's more than 30,000 a day. But at the same time, in terms of the number of cases that are needing ICU care, the number of cases that are critical, or even the number of deaths, these are far, far lower in terms of percentages compared to what they were before. So in that sense, there is a rationale in terms of moving forward and, as EIZAZ was saying, reopening things so that we are trying to find this balance between health priorities as well as economic priorities. My concern is one, in terms of the clarity of regulations. So the SOPs, these can be a little bit confusing at times, and that's a bit of an understatement. But then KKM did come up with a website, I think. It's a COVID SOP website, which actually gives you very clear guidelines as to who needs to do what. And secondly, it is not a message to say that, we are now immune, we are now superhuman, because the virus is still there. The virus didn't get the memo about it changing behaviors on the 1st of April, and it's still going to affect us in many ways. So things about being boosted, wearing a mask, ensuring that we protect the more vulnerable of society, that hasn't changed and will not change at all.
Yes, and I think this is a conversation that we've been having throughout the week as well, with regards to what the endemicity means to the regular public and to people in general. I think we had a discussion with Nordin as well, Nordin Abdullah, the crisis analyst, how I think we find that a lot of the accountability and responsibility will fall back into the people's hands to ensure that we keep each other safe. We've always had this hashtag, right? Kita jaga kita, and it still remains the same. We have to be responsible to create that environment that's safe for us, family, and those who are around us, as well as our fellow countrymen as well. So let's talk about border reopening, though, because I think essentially what the endemic phase was spelling out in terms of on the 1st of April was the opening of borders, which allows for both, not just incoming tourists, but for us to be able to freely go and come back without quarantine if we are fully vaccinated. So perhaps we can start with you, EIZAZ, on this for the border reopening.
Oh, border reopening, I think it's something that all of us have been looking forward to, including myself, right? There are places that I do want to go. My thoughts on it, right? There are a couple of borders that we're looking at. You're looking at sea borders, land borders, and air borders. I think a lot of focus has been put on the air borders, and they appear to have quite a strong process flow for airports, right? There's enough space, there's rooms, there's ample locations for you to set up, for example, on-arrival testing. What do we do about the land borders, right? So the land border, in an airport, right, a plane will come and you have the passengers disembark, and that would be it. When you open land borders, you're talking about private vehicles. You have cars, you've got bikes, you've got vans, you've got all sorts of things coming in. And I think what has been moved forward from there is, I believe you have to take an on-arrival test within 24 hours of your arrival within Malaysia. And that is, I think, a very, very good move, because what happens is test within 24 hours. You don't have to test at the entry point, at the source, and you will really discharge a lot of this congestion. I think that's a very, very good move.
But it's also reciprocal, right, Elane? Right. So there's this whole border reopening. It's only reciprocal because only we can say we don't need quarantine, which is fair. But then the receiving country must also have the same thing. So now we probably have it, I think, in Australia. And then for those who don't have it, we have the VTL approach. So I think this is I think we have spoken about this quite a number of times. Some sort of a harmonization of international travel procedures across countries. But then there is this vaccine equity issue also, right? So there's like the whole, what you call the rich nations, 2/3 of them vaccinated. If you look at the poor nations, about 12%, if I remember numbers right. So that's vaccine inequality. So you're really not sure if you travel to Australia is okay, but if you travel to Africa, would this apply?
No, I think the one of the quarantine I was mentioning that I think changes a lot for a lot of Malaysians is that when upon your return, there's no mandatory quarantine. So that helps with regards to how soon you can go back to work. As long as your PCR is negative, you can resume work. You don't have to do another 5-day quarantine and apply for the entire procedure prior to arriving, home quarantine, and all that. So I think that eases a lot of that worry with regards to travel, whether it's for work, leisure, or even if you are visiting family. So it allows people to have a lot more confidence with being able to resume back to work after that. So, Doc, do you have any comments with regards to border reopening?
I tend to agree with what Dr. was saying as well, because there is this huge inequality, right? And one of the things of the pandemic is generally in society, you see the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, or getting stuck with different issues. And that seems to be applicable to countries as well. The countries with very good access, not only in terms of vaccinations, but in terms of the capacity to deal with COVID can see a huge difference. And we are quite fortunate, I think, and sometimes we forget how fortunate we are that we have got so many people vaccinated. And even when it comes to treatment, we have a lot of drugs that are now available that we can give quite easily should the need arise. And the other thing I would say that also touches back to what EIZAZ was saying earlier on is capacity building. So this lull that we've had over the past few months, that has been used to increase our ability to deal with increased ICU cases, which is what we will see. Because even though the percentage may be small, if you are dealing with higher volumes, then a small percentage of a large volume is still going to have an effect on our capacity. And that's something that moving forward we have to keep a very close eye on as we open up borders and open up more travel.
I think what I wanted to know individually from our panelists is what are you looking forward to with regards to this endemicity announcement in terms of the 1st of April? Let's start with you, AT.
No, again, right. So a lot of changes that has happened over the pandemic phase, that 2 years, work from home being one. So a lot of infrastructure, a lot of cost, a lot of work rearrangements have been done. Some of it working at this point in time. So you permanently find there's a lot of permanent changes that's going to take place in the workers and in the workplace. So these three things are really going to change permanently for some. For some who probably never found this very practical, probably want to revert back to their conservative or the conventional way of doing things. And business as usual is not going to be norm. And many businesses now, even if you really realize we cannot survive for just domestic tourism alone, we still need international arrival to kickstart our tourism. Otherwise, our hotels are still not fully booked, except maybe for the weekends. So a lot of changes happening at the economic level, transitionary, but here to stay.
Doc, what are your hopes for the endemic phase, and what are the things to look out for, really?
I think, again, businesses have very changed, and we need the movement of goods, movement of people, the economy churning back again, because we're doing very well with the exports. But don't mind you, we also have that 2 years lost out in terms of the supply chain, and the supply chain really going to kill it. You look at the electronic industry. 9 months, China ate into 11% of our palm oil, oil exports. It's just in 9 months, 11% we lost out. So
we've got a lot of room to catch up on. Yeah. Dr. Helmy, your thoughts and your hopes for endemicity and the things to watch out for, really?
I'm just thinking about that. Was saying about hotels being empty. We can fill it up with each state having a state election. Now hotels will start filling up state by state, right? Because Johor, I think, is quite full at the moment.
Tomorrow they're empty.
Yeah, exactly. So next week we have to think of some other way of doing it. But that lies into the other thing. In terms of opening things up, if I think of it from a medical perspective, the great thing about it is I do have patients, families, friends who also have been deprived of family, being able to spend time with family, with friends. I've had patients who maybe their kids were in Singapore and they were very, very unwell. And even, it's a relatively short distance, but unfortunately they couldn't come across to visit. So things like that, the human side, I think, is something that perhaps is not so much appreciated sometimes. So that's something to look forward to. And the other thing is also, at some point, I assume that there may be another variant of some sort. So I think we need to be aware of that, and we need to have mitigation plans in place. If there was another variant, what do we do? Do we shut down again? Do we keep things open and just accept the fact that there's something new? So these are things that are ongoing in the background, but it's something that we need to be quite clear about.
EIZAZ?
So I'm looking at it from a border control mechanism and a process flow mechanism, right? Coming back to what Datuk has said about vaccine inequality, right? So what happens, vaccine inequality has also led to vaccine cert inequality. You are what the cert says you are. So I think there's no harmonization yet over the structure of vaccine certs coming in, people going out. I think I've mentioned this before, but maybe we should have like an ASEAN cert. We don't have to go too far, but I think we could certainly push the agenda forward, right? For mutual recognition of certificates and types of vaccines. And because when some of these certs are not even in digital form. Some of them are actually in like a paper form. So how do you verify this, right? I think something probably can be done there. So to ease this entire reopening again.
Elane is muted.
Sorry, Elane, you're on mute, Elane.
You're muted.
Hello.
Yes. Welcome
So
back.
I wanted to go on and touch on some other topics because even though we are, looking forward to endemicity and stuff, things are still happening around the world. The war isn't over. Ukraine-Russia crisis is still happening. And Aziz, you wanted to touch a little bit about the economic impact of that on Malaysia. Perhaps you can quickly touch on that.
So far we've seen the positive and negatives of it. Oil palm prices are at an all-time high, a record history high. The prices of oil, I think Brent has hit something like $140 per barrel, which is very, very high. The government has announced, I think, a potential of 25 billion ringgit in subsidies due to the huge oil price spike that we have. But moving forward, right, I think the impact will not be direct. It will probably be with Malaysians, trading nations, major nations in Malaysia, especially those that have a significant dependence on commodities. And one of the biggest commodities coming up from Russia and Ukraine is wheat, right? And it is a staple food of those in the Middle East, staple food of the North Africa region. So it may very well end up that if they are a strong trading partner with Malaysia, we may see prices spike, we may see supply chain inefficiencies. And those are things to really think about, right?
E.T., any thoughts?
Yeah, that's another thing, right? So Ukraine maybe is 7,000, if I'm not mistaken, some miles away. But then if you really see, the impact is very local because the oil prices and like what Izzah said is, while it's going up, we may have, if I remember, 16% of our revenue in the budget comes from oil. But once it exceeds 100 ringgit, it's a cannibalization process because our subsidy starts increasing. I think Finance Minister mentioned 28 billion if we go at this rate. So again, it is not very, very beneficial for us to have this Ukraine crisis going on because it may be very short term, but we are still paying 28 billion out. So net, we still lose. And I can tell you this whole disruption has actually brought back the question of nationalization of economies. You look at what Russia is doing, like everybody has exited Uniqlo, the Starbucks, McDonald's, and they say, look, we were probably going to corporatize this internally. And I can tell you a practical thing is our students in studying in Russia now can't even take out money from the ATM because the banks are closed. The credit cards don't work. So what transaction do they use?
So it's sort of putting everyone off kilter. Doc, Helmy, any thoughts on this?
A couple. I think one, going on with what Datuk was saying, I think the whole world has seen how one country has been punished for essentially not following certain directions. And that, I think, is going to create fear amongst other countries that may feel that they are perhaps a bit too dependent on the international finance system. So countries are probably going to start moving into their own systems, or they'll have different blocks. And I think Malaysia, being traditionally someone who's very much in the middle, very neutral, we're going to have a bit of trouble trying to navigate these things. Secondly, oil and gas, I think, is quite, it's very obvious how it's affecting us. But even smaller things like corn, for example, prices are going up. Feed for chickens are going up, which means chicken prices are going to go up. So there's this knock-on effect, right? And you can't control prices forever. So the government is going to start talking about subsidies for food, subsidies for oil and gas. At some point, revenues may not be enough. So what does the government do? Do we then maybe reintroduce GST? Is that something that is politically acceptable? And then that will have an impact on elections. So you can kind of see in many different ways where, one small thing actually has a knock-on effect, and it may actually lead to a decision as impactful as when we're going to have our next elections.
There you go. So I would also like to quickly jump into elections, of course, Johor polls. Any comments and any feedback? We've talked about the Johor elections for quite a bit now. Perhaps we'll start with you, Izzaz, because we're not in the discussion the last time we were talking about Johor elections.
So very interesting, very exciting. I think this is the first time in history we're seeing like 7, 9, 12 corner fights, which is really mind-blowing. And what's interesting from this is there are a couple of new parties that have come to the fray, right? And all of these new parties appear to be multiracial. You have Warisan, you have Muda, you have Parti Bangsa Malaysia, and the fact that these parties are actually in there and they may not have like mainstream traction, but there is some form of support. So Are we looking at a voter sentiment change towards the sort of parties? And the next thing is, I think the electorate is starting to get a bit more mature, and we're starting to look at things that are beyond individuals, beyond parties. We're starting to look at things like policy, right? So I suppose those parties who actually will have a strong roadmap, a strong plan for Johor, right? They're out and say, this is what we're going to do, here's how we're going to do it. People are starting to pay a lot more attention to these than ever before.
Let's go with you, Dr. Helmy. Your thoughts on the Johor elections?
I'll be quick. I just look at all the pictures and the videos and think, oh, there goes another cluster. Because, you know, half the people are not wearing their masks, wearing here and things like that. And you just think, so throw your hands up in the air and go like, okay, hopefully on voting day tomorrow, you know, whoever's going to vote, please do take whatever precautions you need to take. Wear your mask, keep your distance, and, you know, be a bit sensible, I suppose.
And I suppose there was the cautionary measures that they're asking people to go at different times, you know, check on your apps so that you are able to sort of lessen any of the sort of crowds at any one particular time. AT, Johor.
I think I want to be predictive in the sense that while a lot of anticipation is there for change, but I think Barisan will make it just short of 2/3. Just short of the 38 seats they need in the 56 they want to agree. So it just fall short of that.
So you heard it here first, 80s predictions. Right here on The Nation This Week. Now, I'll quickly touch on, because we've not much time left, we've got a couple of minutes. I want to talk about International Women's Day. This week, we celebrated women. I know I'm in a company of stellar men that, of course, celebrate women, I'm sure. I'll make my predictions. But the hashtag for this International Women's Day was Break the Bias. And one of the things that was brought up when Farida was together on the show with us was to question those who have literally put that as the slogan, Break the Bias, the UN themselves, because looking at the UN themselves, they need to walk the talk. So from the male perspective in the panel today, let's start with you, Dr. Helmy HAJA MYDIN. Your thoughts on International Women's Day and the hashtag Break the Bias.
I was talking about this to my wife, actually, and we were talking about how it would be nice in one day there wants to be a need for these things, but I think that day is, you know, not anytime going to be anytime nearby. And unfortunately, I think most of us men, we don't really feel or understand or empathize with the challenges that we have, or rather women have. And it's important that I think we engage more and then we are more vocal about it, because it's not going to change unless we ourselves are aware of what the challenges are. And sometimes it's as simple as having that conversation like what we are doing right now.
Fantastic. AT.
Yeah, I think the Break the Bias kind of brings back the narrative, and it's kind of reinforces the fact that we must keep the narrative going to bring back women equality. Break the bias. This right? Yeah. break
the bias.
This is the one, right? This is the one.
I don't know. We're trying to create a conversation. I think it's like Doctor said, it's about having that conversation, being open about it, having people talk about it. I just like to point out that women in politics, Women Development, Family and Community Minister, the involvement of Malaysian women in political empowerment, especially regarding ministerial and parliamentary positions, still lags far behind that of men. And that's very clear. According to the Malaysia Gender Gap Index 2020, women's score in political empowerment was the lowest at only 0.1 compared with other some indexes. So these are still lots more for us to do work in. And Malaysia continues to see an increasing number of new women investors in the stock market. So that's good news, representing 36% of new central depository system or CDS accounts open year to date. So we're gaining some ground there. And in 2020, 32% of the CDS accounts were held by women, and the number rose 34% last year. So, gentlemen, the women are catching up in investment. So it's not just a men's game there. EIZAZ, your thoughts on International Women's Day, breaking the bias?
Well, we can always look towards history and see some of these people have completely broken the bias. Growing up, you know, we all had childhood heroes. Mine was Neil Armstrong, and there were two women that were there. Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space, and another very, very famous individual, Marie Curie, who basically discovered radiation. So biases have always been broken. And if we look through history, there have been so many people who have paved the way. I think what we should do, we should really start recognizing those, right? If that you are truly capable. And I think if you're talented, if you are persistent, if you've got it, it will show. And history has proven that time and time again.
Thank you, gentlemen, for sharing your thoughts. I hope that any men out there who are watching, please celebrate the women in your lives. They are there, they're supportive. I cannot tell you enough how much as a woman. I think I'm not sure whether men know this, but there are so many things that come into consideration. You're a mother, you're a homemaker. You go to work. You're also the best friend for your friends, your partners, your family. The support network that women have for each other, I applaud it. Thank you very much to all women out there, sisters out there, mothers out there, daughters out there, for continuing to support the nation, support the community, and support all of us globally. Thank you, gentlemen, for the conversation this week. This was, of course, The Nation this week. We had the panelists, EIZAZ AZHAR, Managing Director for 7W Associates, Dr. HELMY HAJA MYDIN, Respiratory Physician, as well as Dr. A.T. KUMARARAJAH, Treasurer General, NCCIM. Thanks for staying with me till the end of the show this week. Have a fabulous weekend. Bye for now.